It is that time. We are jumping into part three. I'm super excited. I can't wait to get into part three. We've spent a lot of time on part one and part two. And part three, we're going to dive in just a little bit deeper, and I'm going to show you exactly how it all ties in together. So if you're joining me and you're just now jumping in, we are going to dive into part three. This really is the focus of AI measurement and scalability. And also, if you missed part one and part two, I'll make sure to share that in the link for you as well so that you can review that and kind of go back. So we cover a lot in part one and two. And we go beyond just surface level and we're diving deep into the foundation and then also what steps to take. So I think that part three really is going to be an eye opener in terms of how you measure AI and also scalability as well. So we talked a lot about part one and part two. And if part one was like your foundation, and then part two really was about your strategy, right? And this is where you actually make money in this area. You've got governance, you've got operating models, you've got the projects running. Now, the real question is any of this actually working? Most companies can't answer that question. They're spending millions on AI and they have no idea if it's actually moving the needle. I worked with a healthcare organization spending about 1.2 million annually on AI tools and pilots, but they couldn't tell me if they've improved patient outcomes or if they were able to reduce staff burnout or accelerated approvals by even day one. This is really how you measure what matters. And this is how you prove ROI and scale the wins instead of just experiments. So we're covering the four competencies that separate the leaders from making money from AI with the ones losing it in the noise. So our focus next is going to be on impact measurement versus activity measurement. So here's the fundamental mistake. Most companies measure activity and not actual impact. And the reason why this is so critical is because it's a fundamental mistake. Activity measurement is the fluff. We ran 12 AI pilots, we trained 400 people, we deployed 5 models. These are inputs. They sound really impressive in a board meeting, but they're also really useless because you need to be able to have that breakdown of information. You want to be able to focus on pilots completed, the training sessions, the models that were actually deployed. You want it to make sense, right? And you have to do more than just talk about fluff. You have to do more than just only focus on part of what the process is. I'm going to share my screen with you as we go through some of this information as well. So when we talk about impact measurement, what it actually matters is that we're looking at the outcome of the activity. Did you do a throughout increase? Did it cost extra money? Or did the cost decrease? Did the quality improve? These are the questions that we're looking for when we're looking at the actual outcome. We're thinking about these things, right? And we're also looking at it from the perspective of, did a specific business problem actually get solved? So let's talk about a case study so that I can really connect this for you and you have a better understanding of what I mean by this. We look at a pediatrics hospital that implemented an AI prior authorization system. right? And the activity metrics, it looked really great. It often does when we're looking at larger numbers and we are not able to actually translate it right away. Oftentimes they look rather impressive, right? So we look at activity metrics, and the way that it looked like was that systems deployed in 6 weeks, 150 staff members were trained, 8,000 authorization requests were processed. But the real metrics, those told the actual story. So processing time, 4 minutes, 14 minutes is where we started and dropped down to 3 minutes. That is a 78% reduction. Approval rate from 68% down to 87%. So that's actual quality improvement. And then staff hours recovered, 240 hours per month. That's a full three, that's like three full-time people, right? Revenue impact, that was about $4,200 per day in recovered approvals. So the activity metrics that got them funded, right? But now we need to look at the impact metrics that actually made them the real money. So here's how you build a measurement system that actually matters. When we look at the four metric categories and what's working together, we're looking at baseline metrics. And what we want to know is exactly where you are today, right? What is the current process and time? What's the current approval rate? What's the current staff allocation? Because this is your honest assessment. A really great example is underwriters spending about 6 hours per day on documentation review. Target metrics is where do you want to be? So the realistic improvement you want to look at, is it 30%? Is it 50%, 80%? You want it to be really specific, not faster, exactly how much faster. So a good example would be reduce documentation to 2 hours per day. So it looks a lot like impact metrics, right? What does the change mean? What's the business value of that improvement? We're looking at time savings, payroll cost saving, or capacity to take on more volume. You're looking at quality improvements that equal revenue protection or premium justification. So a great example would be 4 hours times 15 staff members times $45 per hour. Loaded cost is about 432K annually. So we're really breaking down these specific areas and we're getting very, very detailed on what we're looking at. This way we can translate that into the true impact. And then we're looking at gating metrics. Now, what has to be true for this to actually work? That's the question that we're asking. What assumptions are you making? What has to stay constant? What would break this if it didn't work? So a good example is volume stays constant, or staff members don't leave, or the system uptime is about 99%. So here's how this works in practice and what we're looking at is that we're looking at financial services or mortgage organization. Um, it's the baseline that we want to focus on, right? Manual documentation verification, 3.2 hours per application. Application volume about 2,800 per month. Cost per application, $180. Monthly labor cost is about 504K. And that's the baseline of an implementation. And the target is AI plus human review model, 1.2 hours per application, still 2,800 per month, with a projected cost of $67.50. So its projected monthly labor cost is about 189K. The impact, this is how we measure the impact. The labor savings is about 315K per month. Annual runtime is 3.78 million. And then the implementation cost, that's 420K. The ROI payback is 1.3 weeks. So when we look at the gating metrics, we want to document that the quality is staying consistent. There are no dramatic increases in partial documentation. The AI model accuracy is about 94%. You set the actual threshold for what this looks like. The compliance review time, it doesn't increase. Staff remain available. You can't cut them immediately anyway. So they're very important to this particular process and also how you document information. Now, here's where people really go wrong. When we're looking at the 750K lost value, we're looking at it from the perspective, it's the same company, different approach, right? They implemented the system, but didn't actually establish gating metrics. What actually happened is that AI system deployed, but staff didn't trust it. They kept manual review anyway, and it's not a parallel review, right? I don't really believe it review. So that means that they're not necessarily digging in a little bit deeper for accuracy or efficiency. The net effect is 1.2 hours. So that's AI plus 2.1 hours manually. That equals about 3.3 hours, maybe actually a little bit slower. So the additional cost, extra labor, right? 35K per month, plus AI licensing and infrastructure. That's about 125K per month. Over 6 months, we're looking at 960K in unexpected costs because now we're doing double the labor and you didn't even know it, right? You have to dig in deep and look at the impact and keep a lookout for these red flags. So they had to shut it down. The gating metric would have caught this immediately. So if staff compliance review time doesn't decrease, we have a problem. They would have identified this in week two and not in week two and not in month 6. So we would have actually caught this a lot sooner. So let's look at what this looks like in terms of breaking down the metric type, the example, and the result. We're looking at activities. We're looking at what sounds impressive, right? The difference. We're looking at what is the missed point, things that we should have been caught in week 2 and not month 6, as I had mentioned before. So if you're following this process, you would catch this, you would actually catch these issues much, much faster. So I want to talk a little bit about like what happens when you try to scale. The next thing that we're focusing on is scaling bottlenecks and removing strategy. So you've got one working AI project, revenue is coming in, business case is proven. Now you want to scale. You want 5 projects, then 20, and then you want your core operations. So this is where most companies really crash, not because AI doesn't work. It does, but the issue is that they crash because they are blind to scaling bottlenecks until they already are losing money. So I want to show you the 7 bottleneck types and actually how to diagnose each one. So we're looking at bottleneck plus data. So it's a diagnostic question. Is your data clean enough to scale to 10 times to value? Do you own data or license it? What is your data refresh cadence? How long does it take for you to get new data into the system? These are diagnostic questions that are important to be able to answer and within a reasonable amount of time. So the cost of discovering during scale, you have 5 AI projects running, Model 3 suddenly fails because data quality dropped. You have to pause 3 of your 5 projects to figure it out. And that's 240K in monthly run rate. It's just sitting idle while you try to investigate. So the cost of fixing it proactively, data governance infrastructure in 1 year costs about 120K, but it also prevents the crisis. So here's a good example to pull from. In healthcare, if you have a working AI system based on clinician notes from 2023 data, let's say, you want to scale it to your second hospital. They started using new EHR in January 2024. So the fields are going to be different. You know how some information just doesn't transfer over very well. The terminology is also different in terms of different fields that you used to name it according to a different platform. The model breaks, 5-week delay while you try to rebuild it. So here's the next bottleneck. It's actually people. And the diagnostic question that you want to ask is, how many AI iterative people do you have per project? How well do they actually work with AI? And do they know how to iterate as well? So how much context sits in one person's head? This is that information sharing that we were talking about, where people are learning things very quickly with AI, but they're not sharing that information with their team or their departments. And can someone from project A move project B tomorrow? Can they move from project A to project B? Do they have enough knowledge to do that shift? Have they been cross-trained? And these are diagnostic questions that you want to answer and be able to ask as well under the scope of bottlenecked with people involved. You know how that can be very complicated, right? And you think you have everything going quite smoothly, and then you find that there's a hiccup in the process. So the cost of discovering during scale is that you have 3 engineers supporting 2 projects, and comment if I'm speaking your language. You want to launch 8 more projects. You assume that you can hire 10 engineers, but you can't, not in 6 months. So you only hire 2. Now your scaling roadmap slips 18 months. Your competitive window also closes. Sound familiar for some of us? So the cost of fixing proactively, it's a knowledge transfer. You want to actively transfer knowledge. You want to have people filling out information where you actually can share it and you review it, you assess it, you have conversations about it. So that happens through documentation and cross-training programs. It could cost you roughly about 80K, but now you know where the information is and how to absorb it, right? So here's an example in financial services. One senior data scientist built the origination AI system. They're phenomenal, right? The company wants to scale to commercial lending, business banking, and credit assessment. So they asked her to lead all 3. So she's now at about 250% capacity, burns out in 4 months, and the project stops. Where are we going to get that information from? Where is that knowledge of that should have been transferred so that you can continue this process? So let's talk about bottleneck number 3, the process itself and the diagnostic questions that you should ask. How many manual approval steps does it take for each model? The other question is how long form approved to test and then live production. What's the differences between the two? How long will it take? Are these processes documented or is it just tribal knowledge? And how do you handle model failures or retraining? So the cost of rediscovering during scale is that you can build and train models really fast, but your deployment process takes 8 weeks. So you have 12 models that are ready. Your deployment queue backs up to about 6 months, right? And projects, they just sit in limbo. The cost of fixing it proactively, you're streamlining, you're documenting, you're trying to deploy the process as well. And it's about 45K just to build. So that cuts deployment time from 8 weeks to 2 weeks. And now you can launch 2 models per month instead of just 0.5. So here's a good example so that you can really soak this in and hopefully it resonates depending on your department or where you are in this particular process. So if we're looking at an insurance company, great at building models, deployment requires IT security review about 3 weeks, right? Compliance review about 2 weeks, customer communication about 2 weeks, parallel run 2 weeks, cut over time 1 week. So total is about 10 weeks minimum. When they scaled, they had about 8 models ready. Only 1 could deploy per quarter. The good idea is just that. No one there to watch or to review. So let's talk about bottleneck number 4, the leadership decision making. So, who approves new AI projects? This is something we want to ask in the diagnostic questions. And you can post that in the chat as well. If you already have someone within your team, your department, your organization, who typically does that? Who approves new AI projects for you? And how long does it typically take? So, is there a consistent framework for we do this versus we don't do this? Because that's going to be important. You want to have that already outlined, and you want it to be something that you consistently follow. And how many times do projects get reshaped midstream by different stakeholders? Do leaders understand AI well enough to make decisions? So the cost of discovering during scale is that, let's say you submit 6 projects for approval. Finance wants different ROI thresholds. Clinical wants different risk parameters. Operations wants different timelines. So projects get sent back for revisions at least 3 times each. Year one scaling plan delays to year two. Cost is about 1.8 million in lost opportunity. Of course, if you're a smaller business, this loss might be smaller to you as well. However, the impact is very great. So the cost of fixing it proactively, clear governance, clear rubrics, clear decision authority, 55K to establish. So approval times drop from 12 weeks to 3 weeks, and then the project continues to move. So I want to look at the bottleneck cost and diagnostic questions that you should also ask. What's the cost per deployed model? What does that scale? Is it linear or is it exponential? What's your hidden costs? Data infrastructure, you're looking at monitoring, retraining, staff time. What costs don't show up in year one, but it crushes you in year three? This is when everything is looking great on the P&L, the reports are looking good, but then you don't find it until you're much, much further into year two or year three. You still lost money either way, right? So the cost of discovering during scale is that you assume each model may cost a certain amount. So you scale models based on that information, and then you're learning that it actually costs you more. And then you're just out of the budget. So the cost of fixing it proactively, do a real cost model now, not an estimate. What does it actually cost, right? From your first project, then your project forward. And then you want to budget accurately. You save yourself a lot of money and time from a huge expensive surprise. So as we focus on the bottleneck of integration and architecture, how many different systems do your models need to talk to? So this is a diagnostic question. And if you already have a process in play, you kind of have an idea or a concept, you go ahead and post that into the chat as well. How many different systems do your models need to talk to? How often do these systems change? What's your API strategy? So what happens when you need to connect to legacy systems that aren't API ready? The cost of discovering during scale is that your AI model lives in the cloud. Your second model needs to integrate with an on-prem insurance system, right? That's an example that I'm giving you so that we can kind of connect the information together. So you have to build custom integration code, and that could cost also delays as well and unexpected engineering costs. So the cost of fixing it proactively is to architecture and audit integration, and then planning upfront. How much might you need for any surprises that you're not ready for? So let's look at the bottleneck, governance and compliance. How much does your first model need to comply with regulatory, contractual, and ethical concerns? How does that change with scale? These are diagnostic questions that we want to ask under governance and compliance. Who owns models that we would monitor after deployment? And what's your process for the model versions update? So you want to think about the cost of discovering during scale, and then the cost of fixing it proactively. So extensive governance framework that can accommodate varying risk, And then also, what would each new model inherit with the framework instead of just requiring custom governance? You want to look at all of those areas to make sure that it makes sense. It doesn't cost you extra time or money without showing that it's not actually working. So I want to look at a case study here. This is technology-enabled healthcare platform with a 2 million AI investment planned across four models. So model one is a data anomaly detection. It deployed successfully in 8 months. Model two delayed 4 weeks because model one required data infrastructure rebuild. Models three and four delayed 12 weeks because data bottleneck cascaded, plus governance and questions weren't clear. Total project delay about 4 months. The budget overrun is about 2 times the expected cost for infrastructure and compliance. So the total impact was about 16 weeks actual versus 1 million expected. Big, big difference. So if they'd address bottlenecks proactively, they would have been looking at a 3-month delay prevented, right? And also 1 million cost overrun. They would have been able to prevent that as well. The competitive advantage window still stays open while they're managing and proactively addressing these bottlenecks as well. So I wanted to show you one other case study. Well, actually, I want to focus on instead of another case study, let's talk about the people bottleneck and burnout. What often is underestimated is how much information that people are processing. And then when you add AI into the process as well, there are a lot of things that can go wrong. So we're looking at what is going wrong with the company had assumed that they could lead new projects, right? Simultaneously. We talked about this one a little bit earlier. They're managing multiple projects because they like their work. The problem is they put, as they say, too many eggs in one basket. So what should have happened is that they should have had clear documentation from the project and not locked into just one person just because we trust you. This is actually an issue that is ongoing and not just with AI. And you'll notice that with people in different departments and burnout is that this one person is a rock star, but they hold all the information. They have the keys to access, right? They have the keys to success. So cross-training would have been very helpful as well with mid-level engineers during the first project. So they have hands-on, they know exactly what's happening throughout the process. So when this one rock star should happen to pull out for whatever reason, not just due to burnout, if they're having to manage a different project, you still have that critical information and you can still continue to move forward with your assignments and you don't lose out on anything. And then the senior person in the advisory role can review it and not only through execution. So the result is that the projects move forward, people stay knowledgeable, and it continues to spread because now you have the process documented and everyone understands exactly what's happening and what's going on. So here's a thing that I also want to talk about that a lot of people really just do not account for. I'm going to put that off. Okay. The faster that you learn, the faster you also will scale, right? Makes sense. The faster you learn, the faster you scale. So your first AI project that could take about 8 months, your team learns what works and they also learn what doesn't work and what the organization actually needs versus what they say they needed. You hear long wish lists, so lots of things of what you would like to have happen, what you hope happens, what you wish could happen. Sounds exciting. Oh, that means it's going to save us this much time. It's going to save us X amount of dollars. We're going to land here a little bit differently, right? So you start to learn realistically what is actually needed. Then the second project, it may take about 5 months or so. And you're not starting from zero anymore because you know the process, you know the pitfalls. And then the third project, maybe it takes a month less than before. But now you've got playbooks, you've got templates, and you know what to avoid. And as you add on a new project, that takes even less. So now it becomes a routine. It becomes just part of the schedule. You know what to look for. You have your checklists, you have your playbooks, you have knowledge sharing that's happening. So everyone understands what's supposed to be going on, what's not. Where are we within this particular phase, right? But this only happens if you deliberately capture and transfer that learning. If you don't, every project starts at month 8 again. It's like beginning all over again, trying to figure out what's new, what's not new, what should happen. So the components and communities of practice is that you want to make sure that everyone who has touched an AI project in the last 3 months, that they are documenting it and they're also following the compliance and the governance. And are we sharing the same purpose? So you want to share what was learned, and you want to make sure what wins that you have gained, that that's shared as well. So it's not just a status meeting, it's not a project review, it's specifically what did you learn? You know, you want to be really, really specific. So a great example is if you're documenting an agenda, you're saying, maybe give it just a couple of minutes. Project one update, we discovered how to integrate the legacy system. It took us maybe several times longer than what we had anticipated. And we have had a lot of these roundtable discussions, and we're sharing knowledge as well. We're talking about what platforms work better for what particular industries, why they work better, or which department. And then sometimes you have that bit of a mix and match where maybe it's not intended for a particular industry. However, it works really, really well because it has built-in features and components that just make sense for the business. So these are the type of communities of practice that you want to have in roundtable discussions. You're actually sharing your knowledge. You're talking about what your project updates are, what your change management strategies are, what's working, what's not working, what to adopt, at what phases. This is information sometimes that is often not shared or gated information, locked information. Sometimes it's a need to know information, or you don't have the security clearance information. But if you're really trying to make sure that you have successful AI projects, you want to make sure that you are sharing information. And then you have a Q&A session, like, does anyone know about this? How can you help me? Can we research this for our next meeting? What have you found out? And you want to make sure that you are documenting, you're following up, and you're really staying consistent with the information that you're sharing, and also how you document and where you keep your information. Who's updating the playbook? Who's building the data QA framework? When is it happening? So this way now you have a set time frame, you have concrete outcomes, and you know exactly what to expect and also what to look for. And the other component that you should look at is retrospectives. After each project, you want to talk about stable state. Usually like what takes 2 to 3 months after go live, when the dust settles, what does that look like? What specifically did you look at for decision making? What worked that week? What process helped you? What unexpected issues actually, happen? So you want to have a complete breakdown on what that information looks like, who has access to it, what's the foundation, what's the training structure. You want to be really role specific. So before we wrap up today, I want to share a pre-scaling checklist with you. And then we'll talk a little bit about like why it's important and what we're going over today as well. So we're looking at the pre-scaling checklist. And the reason why I think it's truly important and very critical to the success of AI implementation and AI scaling and AI adoption is because it gives you benchmarks. Exactly, where did you start? Where are you now? How long is it taking? Who are the key players? What does your support team look like, right? So before you scale, I want you to look at this checklist. If you can't say yes to all of these questions, then you've identified a bottleneck that needs fixing. So one no means find the constraints and address it before scaling. And if it's dramatically cheaper to fix it now during the scaling process, so you would make an honest assessment about that. What does that look like, right? So starting with data readiness, is our data governance mature enough to handle 3 times the volume without quality degradation? Now, this happens a lot where we are in the process of, or we are used to already collecting the data. Based on systems that we already have implemented, we make the assumption that we are in data readiness, right? Because we've already been doing it. We know the process. We have our checklist. It's not new to us. But what you also have to look at is the quality of data and would it be ready once you expand that volume, because everything could change. It is the information transferring over accurately? Are people going through and taking their time and checking off all of the steps as they should to make sure that you have good, mature data? The next one is people scalability. Do we have a documented process so new people can contribute in week 1 and not month 3? Now, you know how new folks are, not just new to the business, but perhaps also new to a particular project. They're getting in, they're learning the lay of the land, how things should be done, what their comfort levels are. They're not necessarily contributing in a way that an experienced person on the team would contribute, right? So what you want to focus on is having a thorough and documented process so that not just new people, but anyone can jump in and look at this list and see, okay, well, here's where I'm at. Here's what I've done so far. Here's what I've learned within this AI process within our department. Here's what happened when everything crashed and it went down. Here's what we may have lost. You want to have that well documented so that people can get thoroughly involved and also help with the advancement of the process. The next one is process efficiency. Can we deploy a model in under 4 weeks with consistent, repeatable steps? So this ties into your documented process that we just talked about as well. Efficiency. Also, you have to think about what improvements can you make. This is not just a set it and then it's done. You want to be able to understand exactly where you can make changes, what the impact looks like. Is the process itself efficient? If the process is not efficient, everything else tends to just fall apart. So you want to think about repeatable steps, not just, oh, this is mundane, oh, I can just do this in my sleep, but does everyone know what's supposed to happen from step A all the way to step Z? The next one in the pre-scaling list is leadership clarity. Do we have clear project approval criteria that don't require constraint, rework, and debate? You'll see a lot of bottlenecks here. There are people who strongly feel like they are ready to advance to a new phase within the AI project. You may also see people who say, hey, we're just not ready. The key process here is that they may not have project approval for either one, to either slow down the process or advance the process. So we want to make sure that the criteria doesn't require constant rework. Someone did something that they perhaps should not have done, or they were not requested to do so, and it interrupted the process. It could have caused some issues along the line. That requires constant rework, which means that you're not going to have the advancements that you need, especially in the timeline that you already have specified. And the debate part, you want to work through all of those issues. You want to ask a lot of questions. You want to have roundtable conversations. You want to have community meetings within departments and then organizational wide to eliminate those type of concerns and bottlenecks. And then cost transparency. Have we modeled the true cost, including infrastructure, compliance, and staffing, and not just licensing? This is the part where a lot of businesses get stuck in relation to AI scalability. They have only looked at one part of their process in the cost breakdown, and they didn't include everything. And so at the end of the day, once they do their total calculations, they're finding we're way off. The budget is just blown. That's usually what happens. It's not, oh, we saved a lot of money. Look what happened. Usually it's the budget is blown. We've spent money in different areas and departments that we thought would be sufficient for what we needed to accomplish, and it didn't work out that well. So now we want to look at integration and planning. Do we know what systems we're connecting to? And have we completed architecture planning? This is really critical because, as you know, when you start to incorporate any kind of platforms, whether it's an AI enhanced platform or AI first platform, do these different programs talk to each other? Do they connect with the different systems that we already have? What I find that happens oftentimes is that people are already relying on one of their primary systems. However, they're either willing to abandon it altogether because they think this AI platform is going to do more or going to be a replacement prematurely. So you need to have a clear roadmap for what integration planning looks like from day one all the way through the full cycle of the integration planning. You need to understand exactly what's going to happen on day 60 if Maria's not out, she won't be in, she's got another project. What happens? So we have lost 5 different people to whatever the issue is. What's going to happen in integration? We have a platform that has gone down, it's missing a key component that we need. What happens to integration? So you need to make sure that architecture is completely planned out from beginning to end. And then there is governance framework as we look at the pre-scaling checklist. So here we built a framework, right, that works for both low risk and high risk models. You want to look at completely and honestly throughout all the departments, what does that really look like? Does this framework, is it applicable across the entire organization or only to certain areas? And if you already have a checklist that you typically use, I would love for you to kind of share not your checklist, but just some components that you found that were really important to you as well, you know, as you go through your checklist and just making sure that everything matches and it just makes sense, right? Because you want to continue to have successful AI projects. You want to make sure that revenue is coming in. You want to make sure that your stakeholders are happy, internal and external. So you want to be able to measure the impact and also identify what bottlenecks exist and make sure that you remove them as well. So you've got governance, you've got the operating models, you've got projects running. So now you know how to measure what matters. You know how to prove ROI and scale the wins instead of just experiments, right? So we've gone from the foundation to the strategy to the execution all throughout parts 1, part 2, and then part 3 today. The only question left is, are you ready to compete on AI? If you already have your answers, post that in the chat or let me know. Thanks so much for joining me in part 3. Until the next time, this is Simone signing off with Appelling. Take care, folks.